Alright, hey everyone. This is the next set of videos. This will probably end up being split into multiple videos, because it's kind of a lot to go into all at once. This is a fairly sizable project for what it is. A lot of what it is going to be repeat stuff that we've done before, like colliders and triggers and movement, but with a bunch of new features. So here's a preview of what we'll be doing. By the time we're done with this, we will have a skeleton that moves around and rotates when you move your mouse, and that also rotates the camera. When you move, the camera follows. When you click, he attacks. And when you attack the other enemies, notice first when you walk into them, nothing happens. But if I walk into him while in the middle of attacking, it kills him. So we have a bunch of stuff going on in here all at once. There's also a working pause screen with 2 buttons as well. See, you can hover over and unpause. We can click it. That didn't work. We'll look at that when I make the proper version of it. And if you do the exit game, then it exits. So instead of always only having just keys for it, we can also have buttons for stuff as well. So we can attach scripting onto the buttons. So, obviously we need to start with a blank project, so that's what I have here. A bunch of setup steps we have to do. First, as long as you're logged in with the same account that you used for the previous projects, if you go to the package manager, and then click up here and go to My Assets, you should still have the skeleton from the last couple examples. So, just for simplicity, I'm going to stick with the same thing. Import him into it. Once that's done, we can go ahead. We're going to get those animation errors. Still don't know why those are there. It's never affected anything so far, so we can just ignore it for now. And so we have the skeleton now, and now we can start putting a bunch of environment things together. We'll put the enemy and players in a moment. So first, we're going to make a whole room, pretty much. We're going to make a plane. I'm going to name that floor. Keep that at 0, 0, 0. And we're going to change the scale of it, so that way it's really big. Instead of having to chain a bunch of them together, we can just make one big one. One convenient thing for it is you can go to the scale and edit them and go 3, 3, 3 like that. Or if you undo that, we have this little link button here. And if you click that, it's going to enable it so that way all 3 of these are automatically the same. Which is a neat little thing just to avoid a couple of key presses. Also going to rotate the camera here. So the main way to look at that is in the top right here. We want Z to be forward and backwards, and X to be left and right like this, with Y being up. So this will make it so when we add a positive to either direction, it'll be almost like a graph from like your math classes, where up in the positive direction is up, and positive direction horizontally is to the right. That won't matter too much for now, but it matters that you want to be pretty consistent with this sort of thing, so that way in your code you don't have to negate things. You know, if you are used to going +1 in the Z direction, meaning going forward, but you have your camera facing backwards and you have all the models rotated backwards, then you'd have to deal with it not going the direction you expect it to. So, that is the floor. Now we can start. Actually, we want to group these together to an environment. Forgot that. A very important step. This happened a lot for a lot of people's project ones in a couple ways. For some dumb reason, when you create empty objects like this, it really likes to put these at weird decimal values. I don't know what causes that. You want it to be at 0, 0, 0. You can drag the floor into it. Now we can start adding more. So we can make a cube. It's not going to be looking like a cube. We're going to extend these very much to be the size of a wall instead, but the basic idea is it's still a cube. I'm going to call this left wall. We can put the left wall at -15, 5, 0, and make it scale 1, 10, 30. You can see that makes a giant big wall. Now copy this over, duplicate and call it right wall. You don't even have to change anything except change the -15 to a +15, so it's on the other side. Make a copy of it and make up wall, so that'll be the back side over here. Up wall is going to be at 0, 5, 15, and we need to rotate it. Need to rotate it around the y-axis. So if you remember, the way rotation works is a little weird to get your head around, but when we say rotate, we're not saying to rotate y, sort of, we're saying to rotate around the y-axis. So because the y-axis is up and down, when we rotate it, it rotates around that center point being up and down, like that. That's one way to think of it. Setting that to 90, keep it in the back there. Make a copy of that and call it down wall. Exact same thing, just negate the 15 to a negative 15, and now you have a down wall. Lastly, we can do a ceiling. For the ceiling, we can put that at 0, 10, 0. Now we need to rotate this in two different ways. So we need to rotate both 90. Check my notes. No, only need Z90 rotation, sorry. Scale will be 1 to 30, 30. And now we have a big box of a room. When we place all these cubes around, you'll notice they automatically have box colliders and mesh renderers. And that's going to come in handy because we're going to add a collider onto the player character in a bit that will prevent movement whenever you run into another collider, such as a wall. So that way we can't just walk out of the room. Obviously, nothing's going to happen for now. We haven't placed anything in. So I'm going to add in some prefabs for the skeletons and drag two of them in. Name the first one player, the other one enemy. I'm going to put the player at 0, 0, and negative 10. Obviously you can tweak these numbers all you want on your end, but at least for the sake of following the video, you should definitely just do the exact values and then tweak afterwards. Just that way, I know if you come to me with a question, I'll know that the values are the right thing. Enemy, I'm going to keep at 0, 0, 0, but I'm going to rotate him 180 in the Z, so that way he's facing us. Okay. So far, that is not going to have any functionality whatsoever. But it is a room. We have a room, we have a skeleton, we have some objects, nothing happens. But if you remember, these skeletons come pre-built with a bunch of animations, so since we haven't changed the animator yet, they do the whole cycling through everything. So the first thing we can do is go to the animator. Remember, that's window animator. Drag that. I like having it in the bottom area here. As a reminder, Alt, click, and drag moves around like this, whereas without Alt, it does selecting. I'm going to select all of that, get rid of all of it. And the setup for this is going to be a little differently from previous ones. I'm going to make one state, and you see it automatically snaps onto the entry. Make two more. And the way we're going to connect these together is basically a triangle. So I'm going to make a transition to and from each of these individual ones. Because this time around, we're not going to only use triggers for the parameters, we're going to use booleans. So that way we can have an idle and a walk state that only are active whenever, for example, walk is true and idle is false. Or vice versa. We will use a trigger for the shooting, or the attacking. So that way when he attacks, that's just you hit once and that's over. You don't need a boolean to keep saying, hey, we're still walking. Attack will happen only specifically when you click attack. So I'm going to name the top state idle. That will be our default state, which is why it's orange. Also going to set the motion for that. Search for idle. Grab the first one. Same thing for here. We'll make this the walking state. Search for walk. And attack. Now we have this sort of triangular setup where any given state can get to any other state at any given point. So we kind of avoid the need for using in any state here. You could almost certainly make this work as in a similar way, but I find this a little easier to visualize and think of. So now in the parameters tab, I'm going to make a bunch of booleans. I'm going to make walk, idle. We're going to make a trigger for attack. And now with all those existing, we can now set the individual properties for each of these transitions. So, for example, we can say to go from walk to idle, we want walk to be false and idle to be true. That way in our code, whenever we detect it's time to stop moving and go back to being idling, we would set those two booleans to be the right values. Do the opposite for this. This will be when idle is false and when walk is true. When going from walk to attack, we only need the attack trigger to be true. It's not even a true or false, it's just attack is happening. Same for going to it from idle, to say when trigger. Leaving attack only needs the single true for whichever we're going to. So going from attack to idle, we just need idle to be true. There's nothing to set false. Same for walk. Say when walk is true. Now, the only other finicky weird thing here that is a little weird to understand, I don't fully understand it myself. It was the sort of thing that it happened and I messed with the settings and now it works, is exit time. So most likely all of these transitions seem to default to having exit time enabled, and that gets in the way of being able to go from one animation to a different animation pretty smoothly and kind of interrupting it. If this is enabled, it does a different behavior compared to disabled. For if you switch from, say, walk to idle, it looks differently the way it acts. We don't have scripting yet, so I can't show the difference here. We're just going to change it now, but you can mess with it on your own if you want to get a feel for it. So, what we need to change is the only things that should have exit time enabled are the ones that are leaving attack. So, these two are fine. They already have it enabled. For every other one of them, we want it off. Off for that, off for this, and off for both of these. So again, the only two that should have exit time enabled is the two that are leaving the attack state. Everything else should have it disabled. So next, now we can start doing some of the basic script setup. We're going to use 3 different scripts for this time around, so I'm going to suggest that you make a folder for it. Right-click, make a folder for scripts. Inside that, we're going to make all 3 of them now. We're not going to add anything to some of them yet, but we can make skeleton script. Make an axe hit. That'll come in handy when we're attacking later. And then also make a UI manager. And that will handle our buttons and pausing and all sorts of stuff like that. It's very helpful to have them dedicated into their own scripts here, so that way it's a lot easier to contain everything all at once. While we're here, before we go into scripting, a bit more editor setup here. So for the player, we're going to give the player a rigid body. Rigid body involves physics. It's very convoluted and weird. What I found is if you type inf, it makes infinite values for things. So we're going to give it a mass 1 and then infinite drag. We're also going to make them use gravity. Do the exact same for the enemy. Rigid body 1, inf. That's going to make it so if they start running into each other and if a collision happens, or if anything else pushes them, they're not going to start dragging and rotating and flying away. We also need to attach the skeleton script onto the player. So you can do that either by literally dragging from down here, or if you go to add component and type skeleton, you'll see it recognizes the skeleton script from our project. So do it that way. So once that is all set, we can now open up that script. We can start actually adding some logic to the skeleton. Okay, so we're going to add a bunch of stuff here. For one, we do not need the start method. We're not going to use that at all here, so we can just completely get rid of that and get it out of view. I'm going to add a bunch of stuff here. We're not going to use a lot of it now. They'll come in handy later, but it'll be good to have set up. I'm going to make it public animator anim, public camera cam. We're also going to make some private variables. These are going to exist only within the script. So again, public variables are ones that we can go back to the Unity editor and click and drag references for. So those are going to be references to other objects, usually. For these other ones, these are just going to be script logic. So a bunch of booleans and timers and things that we don't need to set externally. So it's better to have them private. Make that default false. Okay, so most of that will come in handy later. I'm actually not 100% sure if we even need the camera. I'm kind of just copying this from the testing project I have, and I did a lot of changes. I get the feeling we might not need the camera, but we'll leave it there anyways to be safe. So next we can do the same kind of movement steps we've done before. There's going to be a slight difference here because we're going to have the skeleton kind of rotate a bit, but have move H for horizontal. Copy that over and we can have a move Z for vertical. We can set our movement vector to be new vector 3. H, 0 in the y direction so he doesn't change his height. And vertical is Z. This is why it's important to keep in mind the X and Z axes being in the right direction and the right perspective for us, so that way these values end up working. So this is the step that's a little bit differently and weird, and to be fully honest, I don't fully understand how it works. This was something that came from the previous project I had made years ago for this, and it just kind of made it work. Is kind of my grasp of it. It has to do with translating the position of our skeleton in the context of where we are right now, compared to the world as a whole, where we have this difference between local space and world space. That's just what the documentation describes. I don't really have a full grasp on the difference it makes here, but it does seem to be a necessary step. The reason it's going to happen is because we're going to make it so the skeleton changes rotation as we move the mouse, and that's going to involve communicating the camera rotation between the skeleton rotation, and I think it has to do with the way those two things communicate. So we're going to say movement equals transform dot transform direction. Yep, and you can even see the suggestion there. It says transforms direction from local space to world space. Say movement dot normalized times time delta time times speed. And just like before, we can take our position and just add movement to it. That way he now moves in the direction that we told him to move. That is supposed to be a plus equals. Okay. Now this won't do any rotation yet or anything, but at the very least we can go back over, we can make sure that he does move. I also want to make sure the camera's set right, I did not do that yet. The camera is best to be at 3, negative 11.5, sort of like this. We can have it rotate down a little bit in the X direction, something like 19 or 20 maybe. And so now you can see that does work. So there's no animation yet, we'll get to that in a second. But the actual base movement does work at least. So to get the animation working, we can do an if statement to say that if the value of either the horizontal or vertical movement is not 0, that means we're walking. Otherwise we're not walking. We can say if move H is not 0, or if move V is not 0. Use set bool this time and say set the walk bool to be true. Set idle to be false. Otherwise, do the exact opposite. So in other words, if any movement has happened whatsoever, start walking animation. Otherwise, stop walking, go back to idle. We test that again. Still not happening yet, and you can see the reason why is because we didn't do the actual setup inside the editor yet. So this is sort of a reminder that these are all set to none now, because we need to set the actual value of the references in the editor here before we do any testing. So we're making a reference to some animator, and sure, we've mentioned it in the script here, but it doesn't have any value plugged in for it here. We can take the animator, plug that in here, do the camera as well. Axe Collider doesn't exist yet, that's not a problem, ignore it for now. UI doesn't exist either, so we'll deal with that later. All we need for now is the animator reference. Yep, and you can see it works. So as soon as you start moving, he walks, otherwise he stops. There's no weird stuttering happening, and you can view in the animator as well. Select the player. As soon as we let go of any of the keys, or press down any key, you can see the little blue progress bar for the transitions happening, where it's going back and forth between them. So the only missing piece now for animation is to have him attack. We can say for that, we can say if we press the left mouse button, or whatever key you choose. I'm going to use left click here, but we can say input get mouse button down. There are key codes or mouse press kind of shortcuts like above where we can say key code dot this. I'm just going to say 0 straight up because 0 is left click. We're also going to say if as well if the time scale is 1. And that's because later on we'll be pausing and we don't want him to attack if we click when we're paused. So if this is the case, we can just say anim set trigger attack. There are some other steps we're going to add to this part a little bit later, but we're just going to leave this alone for now. Just that way he at least attacks when we tell him to attack. See, now if I click, he does. It's kind of fun to watch the animator just kind of do its thing. You can see no matter whether we're in the middle of walking and we click, or if we're idling and we click. Either way, it goes to the attack animation and then goes back to wherever it came from. You can click while moving, and it works just fine. So that is the basic animation and movement. None of that, very little of that should have been completely brand new at this point, except for the weird transform direction thing. There's probably a way to go about it that doesn't actually involve that. I'm going to be looking into that more. So now we can add in some pausing. So this is also something relatively similar to before, but now we're going to do this in the entirely separate UI manager. So for that, we're going to first make a canvas, because we need to have some way that we can have some text or buttons appear. Make a basic canvas here. I'm going to set it to be disabled for now, just that way it's not visible by default. We also now make an empty object and call it UI Manager, and we can attach the UI Manager script to it. So this object exists purely just to let the script run in the background, effectively. It's just one of the other things that the game will be checking every frame. It'll be checking for inputs for pausing and exiting and all that. So once we do that, we can go into the UI Manager script. Little thing with Visual Studio as well, by the way, if you have this all set up correctly, on the right side you should have the solution for the project here. You can start expanding that. And here's all three of our scripts. So just another way to get to them instead of double-clicking from inside Unity. So the first thing I'm going to add here in the start function is when we're paused and we have the buttons available for us to click, we need to be able to move the mouse then. But when we're in gameplay, when we have the mouse rotating the character and the camera, we don't want the mouse to be going all over the screen then. We want to keep it pretty much no cursor. We want to just have the cursor be locked to the center of the screen and be invisible. The way we can do that is we can say cursor . Make sure I get the right name here. There's a couple ways. Yep, so we can have cursor.lockState equals cursor lock mode dot locked. So the lock state is just whichever state the mouse is currently in. Is it available? Is it able to move around freely? Is it just constrained within the window of the game? There's a couple options you have. We're going to set it to be just locked completely. You can see that says lock the cursor to the center of the game view. You also need to add a reference to the canvas here. Get rid of these comments just to save the space. And so now from within here, we can now do our same checking we've done before. We can say input get key down code.space. We can say if the canvas this should be a game object, not a canvas. So we want to say if the canvas is not currently active and we press space, that means we're unpausing, which means we need to make it visible. I had that backwards actually. If we're pressing space and it's not visible, that means we are actively pausing, which means we want to set it to be active, saying true. We want to We want to make the cursor free again, so we can say there is no lock mode, and take the time scale and make that 0. That way everything pauses, things stop happening. There is no scaling of time anymore. Otherwise, do the exact opposite. Means we can set that to be false, we can set this back to be locked, and set time scale to 1. There are definitely some ways you can kind of simplify this a little bit and make a pause function that takes in true or false values as well as each of the 3 lock states. I made that off camera, but I just decided to keep it out of this to not overly complicate it. But you can definitely save a bit of space and repetition if you get fancy with your function names and simplifying stuff. So now, we don't have anything in the canvas. Make sure the canvas is disabled by default here. So we don't have anything in the canvas, so nothing's going to pop up when we press space, but forgot to set the reference for the canvas here. Very easy to forget this step. So within the UI Manager script, we need to set a reference to the canvas here. You can always tell that's usually the case if you ever get an unassigned reference exception, or a none type or null type exception. It's actually even straight up suggesting you probably need to assign the canvas variable. So let's do that. Take the canvas, drag it here. So now, anyways, we won't have anything appear in the canvas, but the game does still pause. You can also see the mouse. When it's paused right now, the mouse is visible. As soon as I press space again to unpause, the mouse disappears. Pause again, mouse is back, unpause, it's gone. So we've got this toggling state. There's nothing in the canvas, but you can even see that the canvas item over here is appearing and disappearing. So once we do add some buttons in a moment, those will also start appearing and disappearing. So I'm going to cut this video here. We'll do the remainder in the second video.